Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Joining us now is the economic advisor of the Atiku campaign organization and former managing director of Asset Management Corporation of Nigeria, Mustafa Chike-Obi. Good morning. Welcome to the morning show.
Good morning.
How are you? Thank you for joining us today.
I'm fine. I'm all alone in Abuja. It's my pleasure.
It's good to have you here joining us today. All right, so let's start with the, of course, the 2019 budget. The president on Wednesday presented the 2019 budget to the National Assembly. What's your take on the federal government's spending for the next fiscal year? In your assessment, will the budget provide enough economic stimulus to drive growth and attract investment?
I've looked at the budget. It's an extensive document, and I haven't had a chance to review it extensively, but I've taken a first pass at the budget, and I'll describe it as a revenue-challenged budget. As you know, up to the third quarter of this year, the federal government revenues have been about 2.8 trillion naira to date in 2018. If you project 2.8 trillion to the end of the year, given lower oil prices, you will expect a total revenue of 3.5 this year as federal revenues. So because of that, the revenues are so little, you have debt service next year of about 2.3 trillion projected. So over 60% of the budget of the revenues next year will be spent on debt service. So I don't see how they can accomplish what they hope to accomplish in view of the revenue challenges that the government faces. I think the solution that the federal government needs to look at is a way of increasing revenues or of increasing spending without basically creating money from other sources. In the short run, that will be very difficult. But I think that the solution lies in using the government balance sheet to provide guarantees, federal government guarantees to the private sector. We've been championing this guarantee program for years, where the federal government basically gives guarantees to the private sector for certain projects, and the private sector then goes out and raises the money, because based on the guarantees, it's easier to raise the money. So my view is that because of the revenue challenges, this budget is probably dead on arrival, is unsupportable, and there's no basis for assuming that you can raise almost 7 trillion in revenues next year without some drastic revenue collection strategies, which do not exist in this budget.
We found it curious that after 3 years of being in denial, the executive finally made a provision of 305 billion naira, which is about $1 billion, in next year's budget for the payment of petrol subsidy. What is your take on that?
Well, the thing about the subsidy, first of all, that number is too low. We know that in 2018, the number is much higher, closer to 1 trillion than the 305 billion that they are providing. So it's too low in the first place. But in the second place, I think the way the subsidy is administered, again, is unsustainable. What I would suggest to any government, APC or PDP, is that we change the way we look at this subsidy. We provide what I would call transportation vouchers. In other words, we put Nigerians into 3 categories. High-income Nigerians, that is people who make over 1 million naira a month. Middle-income Nigerians, those who make between 500,000 and 1 million a month. And lower-income Nigerians who make less than 500,000 a month. I know those sounds like high numbers. And we provide some amount of vouchers, transportation vouchers, at the end of the year through their tax returns as subsidy. That way, you can make sure that those in the high income don't get any subsidy. Those in the middle income get some subsidy, and those in the lower bracket get most of the subsidy. That way, the people that you're trying to help, the lower income people, get the subsidies, but they get it post spending the money on transportation and through their tax returns. I think that way you increase your tax net, you increase tax compliance, and you also make sure that the subsidy goes directly to the people who need it. The idea of providing subsidies to a rich man in Ikoyi, Asokoro, Maitama, who has 7 cars, he has 1 car taking his child to school, 1 car taking his made to the market and providing subsidies for them the same way you provide somebody who takes the bus to work is unfair, unreasonable, and unsupportable.
Mr. Mustafa, can
So
I just come in here?
Yes, I will adjust the subsidy regime.
Well, you know that the question of subsidy is not that black and white. It's a highly volatile issue. Do you believe that your candidate, Atiku Abubakar, has the political will to remove subsidy? And how will he achieve this without making Labour incensed and calling a strike?
We're not removing subsidy. We're just directing it to the people who need it, the lower income people. I don't think that people who live in, who have 7 cars, Range Rovers and Land Cruisers need any subsidy. So yes, I think subsidy should be retained, but should be directed more to the lower earning classes. And that way it does what it's supposed to do. It doesn't sustain a rich lifestyle, but it also helps the lower income people. It can be done, and it'll be cheaper, and it'll be done through a tax credit so that people are actually filing their tax returns instead of this random subsidy that goes to the richest people. So we're not removing subsidy, we're just redirecting it and restructuring it in a way that it helps the lower income people the most.
Well, how will you restructure it? Because successive PDP administrations have come up with all kinds of palliatives and all this restructuring regarding the petrol subsidy that did not work and resulted in a lack of transparency.
Well, I'll tell you how you do it, very simply. If you earn under 500,000 naira a month, at the end of the year, when you file your tax return, you get a voucher for transportation, which will be some amount, which will be basically the subsidy. So the subsidy goes to you through your tax return if you're in a low income bracket, and it doesn't go to the rich people, and it cannot be abused that way because it's going to be done through your tax returns. Well, but listen, the fact that the PDP or anybody else, yes.
Go ahead. The fact that the PDP...
If I may continue, the fact that the PDP or anybody else or the military before the PDP hasn't done something correctly doesn't mean we cannot now at this stage correct all the things that have been done in the past. This looking back at what went wrong doesn't help us much. Let's look forward at how to do things properly. And I think this is the way to do it.
Well, let's look at the predications of the 2019 budget. It's premised on a $60 per barrel, oil production estimates of 2.3 million, GDP growth rate of 3.01%, inflation rate of 9.98%, and total projected revenue of 6.97 trillion naira. Are these targets realizable, or are they over-ambitious, given the performance of previous budgets in recent years?
The revenue projection of 7 trillion, 6.9 trillion is fantasy as far as I'm concerned. It's never going to happen. So that's the first thing. The issue about the oil price, I never understand why oil price matters. We can, for example, as a country, sell 1 year's production of oil forward, and we can know the exact price we can get. I think if you go to any Chicago Mercantile Exchange, you can sell your 1 year production and get an exact price. This guessing of the price at 60, 57, I never understand why we do that. We can get an exact price for our next year's production of oil. So that number is a number that can be gotten. I don't know what the number is today, but I think it's above 60. So the 60 is not a problem. The production volumes of 2.3, we have never achieved 2.3 the last 2 or 3 years. I think that's high. I don't see how we can do 2.3. The foreign exchange assumption of 305 is fantasy. Nobody can get FX at 305. I don't know why we don't use 360. It will increase revenues somewhat and make it better for the federal government to meet its targets. So I don't know why we use 305. But all those assumptions aside, the budget is too small. It will not create growth the way we want growth. And we must find other ways to create revenue so that we can have much higher budgets in the next 4 years.
We understand that it's a small, fine economy of Nigeria with almost 200 million people. However, that is what we have. But let me ask you, what will your candidate do differently to expand revenue of the Federation, considering that we are largely a mono economy? What will he do differently in the non-oil sector?
If, for example, we've been harping on guarantees, if we can create guarantees to the private sector of up to 50% of GDP, which is a reasonable and very conservative number. The US, for example, has guarantees out to the private sector of close to 82% of their GDP. If we do 50%, that will create in the next 4 years additional funding of 45 to 50 trillion naira to fund infrastructure projects. I think that without using the balance sheet and guarantees to fund critical infrastructure, Nigeria will have a very hard time developing. So we're going to focus on guarantees. We're going to give responsible, targeted guarantees to the private sector. And I think from that, we can raise all the funds we need to grow our infrastructure and critical construction projects.
All right, let's look at the unemployment report.
Is the answer.
Okay, let's look at the unemployment report
Yes.
that was just released by the National Bureau of Statistics, which showed that the unemployment rate had spiraled to a very worrisome 23.1% in the third quarter of 2018. However, this figure was immediately disputed by the president's spokesman, Garba Shehu, who said the NBS could not have been right since the administration had created 12 jobs through its agricultural policies. Was the president... 12 million jobs. Was the presidency right in its assertion?
Unfortunately, I watched Garba Shehu's theatrical performance on channels where he made that claim. The claim was based, as far as I was concerned, on nothing but speculation. And the only numbers we can accept as a country are the numbers that the NBS gives us. We cannot accept fantasy numbers from presidential spokespeople. The NBS gave us the numbers, and the numbers are terrible. We need to look at those numbers. I've heard people say, well, it's because the population is expanding. It is the responsibility of government to take into account that our population is growing at 3.3% a year. We're creating 5 million new Nigerians every year, and the government must take that into account and have a policy that targets creation of 3 to 5 million jobs a year. We know how to do that. We know that to do that, we have to make some sacrifices. We have to focus on some things, but we will create 3 to 5 million jobs a year if we're given the opportunity to do so. That's what's important. We must employ our people, we must train them, and we must have economic policies that does that. This notion that we have lost 13 million jobs, whatever number it is, in the last 3 years is completely scandalous. It must be reversed. We cannot keep having young people out of work because idle hands create a lot of mischief. So this was a horrible number. It was disastrous for us. And instead of the government saying, look, we must deal with this, they're making all sorts of excuses. There's a population growth. I heard Garba Shehu say they created 12 million jobs in 3 states, where the total population of the 3 states was less than 12 million people. I think he said Kirby, he mentioned 3 states. So it's not the way to go. A responsible government should be very worried about that. They should have an emergency meeting about employment and come out with exact plans how they're going to create jobs in the next few years. They haven't done that, and these denials are actually worse than the numbers.
Are you disregarding the 12 million jobs, the 12 million farmers the presidency talks so much about, who have even gathered to put resources together to ensure his re-election bid? You know, the presidency says that the NBS targets white-collar jobs. And some of those states you have seen a reduction in unemployment are the states which have taken agriculture seriously.
I will lay a challenge right now that nobody can show us any database in Nigeria that has 12 million farmers on it. The 12 million farmers is an item of fantasy. I would like to see any database in this country that has 12 million farmers. I don't think it exists. I think it's a number that they pull out of thin air. And we must just deal with real numbers that the NBS gives us, because they're the ones that are structured to give us those numbers. The 12 million number is just fantasy. It doesn't exist.
Wow.
Given your closeness to presidential candidate of the PDP, Atiku Abubakar, and your involvement in the economic documents that he has released, what would your candidate do differently to create jobs for Nigerians' unemployed youths? And please give us specifics, because you also have this ambitious plan of lifting 50 million Nigerians out of poverty in less than 2 years. How exactly do you want to go about achieving this?
Let me give you one specific, and it may be boring on TV, but let's take housing. We plan to create 100,000 new housing units a year in all the states in the country, 100,000 a year for the next 4 years. I think the number is actually 120,000. To do that, we're going to give out low interest mortgages of about 1.2 trillion a year, 30-year mortgages, single digits, low interest, to qualifying mortgagors. What that does is, if you have 100,000, 120,000 mortgages that are given out every year, average of 10 million a mortgage across the country, you will create from that about 1.5 million direct jobs and about 1.5 million indirect jobs. You will turn Nigeria into a huge construction zone, and it will also generate furniture business. It will generate other ancillary businesses. So we have a plan on how to do that. Please keep in mind that the mortgage market that was developed in the US over the last 30 years, I was one of the principal architects of doing that. So we know how to create mortgages, how to create jobs, and how to create housing in a very, very quick way in the next 4 years. Just in the housing alone, we can create roughly 2.5 million jobs a year. I can go industry by industry how we're going to do it, but it will get boring on TV. It's quite technical. I'm willing to engage anybody on these issues and show them how we can do it step by step. And please, my economic advice has not been limited to PDP or to the Atiku campaign. When the APC government came in, I wrote 4 papers on economic development, and I delivered them to the APC as my duty as a Nigerian. They were all ignored because, having been friendly with the previous government, I couldn't be of any help to them. So it's a patriotic duty. Anybody who has any skills to help us develop Nigeria should do it. And this separation of APC and PDP is quite unnecessary. But these ideas have been tried in other countries. They will work here.
All right.
They've worked in China. They've worked in the US. And I'm quite happy to work with anybody on these ideas.
All right, Mr. Chike-Obi, let's look at the electioneering that has taken off. Many have expressed concern that the PDP campaigns have been lackluster, uncoordinated, and devoid of excitement. What seems to be the problem? Is there any truth in the claims that the main opposition party is struggling to raise funds to mobilize nationwide campaigns?
I will tell you very briefly that my expertise lies in economics and finance. I'm not a politician. I'm not a member of any political party as of the moment. I haven't been to any of those rallies, so I'm not really positioned to speak about that. All I can tell you from observing, like you have, is that one party is campaigning, one presidential candidate is going across the country campaigning, and the other party is not campaigning. And I haven't seen the APC presidential candidate at any rally. So it's not fair to measure the excitement when I've not been there. But I think that in the new year, things will pick up on both sides, and we'll be able to make a better judgment about that.
Well, let me ask you, is Atiku Abubakar preparing for the presidential debate against his main opponent, President Muhammad Buhari? Because even though you say you're restricted to the economies, you also have to prepare your candidates for this debate. So have you also contemplated the notion that the president may assign his deputy vice president, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, to stand in for him during the debate? And if this happens, will Atiku Abubakar still go ahead with the debate?
His Excellency Atiku Abubakar is prepared for the debate. He's been prepared for a debate for the last, I would say, the last 15, 20 years. And he's raring to go. He's like a young man who wants to go into battle, and he wants to debate very badly. However, obviously, he has to be updated on some economic numbers, on some world numbers. And so, yes, we're working with him to make sure he's fully prepared with all the information he needs. But he's raring to go, and he's been ready for a long time. I would advise him not to debate against anybody else but the president of Nigeria. If the president doesn't want to show up or doesn't show up for any reason, I would advise him not to debate anybody else. However, I'm not his principal advisor on political matters. There are many other advisors who are much more savvy than I am about politics. But my advice would be, if the president is not attending the debate, then he shouldn't attend the debate. But he's prepared for the debate, and he's waiting eagerly for the debate.
Mr. Chike-Obi, finally, I'd like to take you back to your point about housing. The Minister for Works, Power and Housing, Babatunde Fashola, has unveiled a similar plan to the one that you have described. How are they distinct, if at all they are?
I haven't seen his plan. If it's similar to my plan, I will support it. I will only say that I hope the scope and the scale is as large as the one we're proposing. But if it's similar and it's going to serve Nigerians, we will support it. But I haven't seen it, and I'll be very, very happy to work with him on it.
Well, all right. Thank you, Mr. Chike-Obi, for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right. It's time now for a short break. When we come back, Uzoma Dozie, Group Managing Director of Diamond Bank PLC, will be in the studio with us to talk about the bank's merger with Access Bank PLC. Do stay with us.